If a little green is good, more is even better. Now, back to Green is Good with John Shigarian and Mike Brady.
Welcome back to Green is Good, and we are so honored today. And when I say honored, I underline the word honored, Mike. We have today with us on the line John Adams and Patricia Adams, and John is the co-founder of the NRDC, and Patricia is one of the founding directors of the NRDC, and this dates back 40 years. And just to make it real simple here, because their bios are two of the most impressive bios I've ever read in my life, and we want to get them on the line right away here. It says here, Rolling Stone magazine said, if the planet has a lawyer, it's John Adams. And I just want to say, Mike and I have started this show, and we are so really, truly honored to have you both on today because of people like you. Welcome to Green is Good, John and Patricia Adams.
Thank you. We're very happy to be here and talk to you today.
Yes, John and Mike, this is a real honor for us, and we're very, very glad that you're letting us talk about the book. So let's go to it.
And speaking of the book, they've just written, co-authored a book called Force for Nature. And I'm just going to say this. They were kind enough to send us an advance copy, and I'm already halfway through it. And Mike, and to all our listeners out there, if you really care about the environment, and if you really want to do something about it, and if you want to find hope and see where we've come the last 40 years and where we're going to go, this is the one book to buy, and this is the one book to read during the upcoming holiday season. Force for Nature, it's called. You can find it on Amazon.com, Borders, Barnes & Noble. John and Patricia, why the book after 40 years? Share with our listeners, what compelled you to write this book?
Well, let me say that the first reason that we wrote the book is we wanted to record the 40 years of the modern environmental movement. And this marks our 40 years and the environmental movement's 40 years. So 1970 is when the first environmental laws were written. NRDC got incorporated, and at the latter end of 1970, after a long struggle, we were granted our tax exemption by the IRS. So we spent all of those early years working on the rules and regulations of the great laws that were passed 40 years ago. Second, we wanted to record the work of a lot of people who no one will remember if they weren't included in this book. These are the people who stood by us, helped us raise money, gave us the creative advice that was needed. They were giants 40 years ago in the law profession in New York. Stephen Duggan is one. David Sive is another. James Marshall, the brother of the great Bob Marshall, is another. And Bill DeWind, who was our chairman for 17 years. These are people that we owe a great obligation to, and they rank as high to me as John Muir does to the Sierra Club.
And I just want to add that over the years we often talked about the importance of all the people who worked together at NRDC, and I was always struck by what a team effort it was, and we were all on the same team. And I love the stories that are embedded in this book, and this book is the stories of people who did particular things to work to save our environment.
Well, let's go back.
It's a model of law, science, and economics combined with the power of citizens, people. And so we think this is a good model, and that people should look at what NRDC was able to do in the 40 years and figure out how they can use our model to do things in their communities, in their regions, in their state, and I hope including in the federal.
I just want to add one. Running through this book is the theme, start small but think big. And that's what a lot of big changes were made by starting small but thinking big and continuing on forward.
Well, you know, when we talk about that, going back to the beginning, Patricia, you and John talk about starting small. You two were in a very small apartment. And
it's a small apartment.
Hard to believe now, just all of the, 40 years later, all of the amazing work that has been done by an organization now world famous, the National Resource Defense Council, that started in your small apartment. Take us back 40 years ago to how that started.
Well, we were living in the village. We had just had our third child, and we talk about one of the reasons that NRDC was started because of the real pollution that was there. The river flowed with raw sewage. The air was so dirty. We tell in the book how when the window was left open in our apartment, our baby would have soot on his forehead, in the morning. That's how dirty the air was.
Wow.
And these things combined with the feeling in 1970 that things could happen. Don't forget, it was the era of the civil rights movement, early women's movement. We did feel, and we were young, that the world could be changed. And, John, I think you could pick up on that.
Yeah, I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office and had a reputation of caring about the outdoors, and a lot of people used to come up to our farm in the Catskills from the U.S. Attorney's Office. So when a group of people who were involved in trying to stop the desecration of Storm King Mountain, it's a famous mountain painted by the Hudson River painters, lots of pictures of it in the Metropolitan, and a group of folks started a big fight about that. It lasted about 10 years, but along the way, several of them came to me and said, look, we don't want to have to go through this again. We spent a lot of money here. We need an NAACP, Legal Defense Fund of the Environment, and you look like a good candidate to come and start it. And with that, and a little help, we went off and started NRDC on January 2nd, 1970.
So they drafted you.
I was drafted.
First round draft pick. How fortuitous! Let's go back just a year prior. Now in 1969, we had something that was a precursor to what just happened in the Gulf. I remember it so well growing up and being a student down in Southern California in 1969, the Santa Barbara oil spill, which led to some great changes in legislation and a new national agency.
Yes, it did. I mean, it played a major role in the creation of EPA and a lot of the laws. And California and the Department of Interior banned drilling in that area. And we have been able, with our California allies, we have 2 offices in California and about 100 people working there, but also with the Sierra Club and others, we've been able to keep Santa Barbara free of drilling. Been a lot of threats to get it back on there now because the oil companies are going farther and farther to extremes to where they go to get oil.
And before 1970, Patricia, did you and John always consider yourself environmentalists?
Well, I grew up in western North Carolina in the southern Appalachians, and my father was in the Forest Service, and I spent my youth camping in the wilderness. His mantra was, "Can't you hear the wild? It's calling you." And John grew up in rural New York, in upstate New York, in the Catskill Mountains. So we both, we were both great lovers of nature, and I think we became environmentalists, which was really a new word in 1970. It's when we looked around at the things that we loved, the natural world being destroyed, and that at that point we were sort of we were always environmentalists and loved nature, but when it became political is when we became official environmentalists.
Yeah, I couldn't back then spell environmentalist. I thought of myself as a conservationist. I just, I loved the farm life that I had grown up on with, and I also was very, very concerned with the sprawl that was taking place across America. People were just moving out further and further into farmland all through New York and really everywhere. And but a group of my friends were very much involved in the Storm King case, so we knew a lot about that. I was meeting with friends of mine who were public interest lawyers in Washington, one of whom was working on the plan for the development of the Alaskan pipeline and very concerned about it coming down through the Arctic and what might happen up there. So we were being pulled a number of ways into this movement, and when this opportunity came along, it was just like, okay, let's go.
If you've just joined our show right now, we're on the line right now with John Adams and Patricia Adams, the founders of the NRDC, and they're explaining their why and how the NRDC got founded and their new book, Force for Nature, which you can buy at Amazon.com, Borders, Barnes & Noble, and all the great bookstores around you. So you start the NRDC. Share with us some of the cataclysmic moments that happened in the NRDC's early history and in the modern environmental law movement, which you are also very involved with.
That is a great question because it really does cover a lot of different things. I would say Rachel Carson the Santa Barbara oil spill, the Storm King case. There were several other major ski developments out in California. And David Brower and his great books, they were all very, very important in the building of the early environmental movement. Then we got started. We got approval to practice law as a charitable corporation in New York, the first time an organization had been approved for charitable practice of law. And the next thing that happened is we applied for a tax exemption. And the environmental laws were being passed, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, but Richard Nixon had a trick up his sleeve, and he did not want radicals bringing lawsuits, and so our tax exemption was blocked. And we then spent 6 months, 7 months, 8 months fighting to get the tax exemption, and it was a bitter, bloody fight that cost us all of the resources we had and almost killed us off. But the one thing it did is it made everybody who was lined up to be on the staff of NRDC, Gus Speth and John Bryson and Dick Ayers and Ed Strobane, all great lawyers, they were looking for an opportunity, if we ever got this tax exemption, to really leave a mark. So the next thing that happened, we got the tax exemption, and that cleared up a cloud for a lot of organizations around the country. Very shortly thereafter, we watched the cases, and in the Storm King case, citizens were given the right to sue, even if they didn't have an economic interest in the outcome. That was a very, very important ruling. And we then saw the power of our members and the role that a membership, even if it was small, could play in cases. We used our memberships right from the beginning to send out alerts about the things we were working on, and that made a huge difference. I would say that the early laws that were passed, NEPA, requiring planning and thought to determine whether the course of action you were taking was the best course of action for the environment. Everyone has to think of that as really one of the most important ideas. Unfortunately, people don't follow that rule as much as they should because there have been exemptions and so on that have taken place. But the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act gave citizens the right to enforce those laws. Can you imagine what that meant?
Wow.
It meant that NRDC could bring as many as 500 lawsuits against polluters.
Wow.
And then I would just say one of the other major events that unified the environmental movement was the protecting the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. And that is, it's something that we have all united behind as just one of the things that we're going to do. Those are just a few of the actions, and there are many others that we could talk about.
Got it. Until I read your book, John and Patricia, I didn't really even realize that the NRDC truly began as a law firm, and has obviously involved in that. You're involved with policy, science, business, and law. So explain a little bit, how that evolution really happened. And we're going to then talk a little bit about the business aspects that are now really, really taking over now in many ways with regards to the movement and how the whole green revolution has evolved over the last 40 years. Patricia, do you want to share some of that with us?
Well, I think the backbone of NRDC has always been litigation, and as you say, it started out as a law firm. And the strength of our litigation arm is always there. It helps go to the table for negotiations a lot easier. And but as you said, over the years, a lot of different forces have been brought to bear. And one thing about NRDC over the years, in the environmental world, even when you do win, it can take years to implement court decisions or acts or to be watchdogs for NEPA. In fact, the EPA said in the early years of NRDC that the lawyers here were like American patriots and revolutionaries who were behind every tree. And often EPA is happy that it has NRDC to help sort of police and be ever vigilant looking at the various cases.
Wow.
Yeah, again, this is a terrific question because it really takes you through the whole movement when you ask about law, and then science, and now economics. When we started, there were 6 of us.
Wow.
And when we finished, we've got 400 plus. So very early on, when people were working on the health issues of the Clean Air Act and the science issues of clean water and toxic chemicals, it became absolutely imperative that we have the kinds of trained people who could, using their master's or doctorate degrees, speak for us. So we began a program of really public interest science. Not easy to do because most scientists look to the future of somehow being connected to science, and they wanted to make sure that their reputation was intact and they didn't speak outside of their field. And what we were looking for were Renaissance scientists. We wanted people who would look at the issues that we were working on and going to work on and tell us, were we in the right direction or the wrong direction, and we didn't want them to be hobbled by the so-called rules of the science industry. So we added scientists, and they have become incredible resources for us. They trained our lawyers to be scientists. And I would say that the credit for this goes to a scientist named George Woodwell, who was at the Woods Hole Research Center, and a great man. This is one of the people who identified climate as an early peril and has continued to lead the country in thinking about what we should do and how we should deal with this very, very important issue. But he was somebody that regularly took on the science industry if they were peddling something that wasn't really good for the public health or for our world. And so we tried to follow that. And then, so that by the time we were in the business 10 years, we had 4 or 5 scientists, and then we started adding people from the Yale School of the Environment and the Duke School and Berkeley School of Energy. In fact, all of our early energy people came out of the Berkeley School, really from under John Holdren. So that was how we built up the various trades at NRDC.
Could I just tell a short story that
Sure.
really about scientists? These were Laurie Mott and Al Meyerhoff in California asking a very simple question. What kind of toxics and pesticides are in the market when you get a bag of groceries? And they actually took them to test them to see what they and their children were eating, and they found they were still full of DDT and other pesticides that had been outlawed for years. And this started a whole investigation about the food industry and the toxics and pesticides used, which resulted in a very big case for NRDC in the 1980s, which was getting rid of Alar on apples that are used so much for young toddlers and children, apple juice and things like that, to make their diet safer. So again, it was asking just a question about what are we eating that led to these big cases that NRDC has taken on.
Our guests today, John and Patricia Adams, founding members of the NRDC. And, John, Patricia, what you've really done, and I love the term that you use, John, Renaissance scientists. What you've done is you have increased your depth on the bench, starting out not just with attorneys, but then getting scientists involved and economists as well. You are connecting the dots. Everything is connected to everything else, and that really is what the definition of environment is. So it really makes so much sense what you did from the beginning to ask the questions, the big questions. How does this relate? How does this connect? Putting the puzzle together.
You're absolutely right. That's what it is.
And so now, with regards to, now you went from 6 committed people, to 400, you were saying, John, now. And so many of the people have been there the whole duration. Mike and I are so honored and lucky to not only have you and Patricia today on the show, but we've had many members from the NRDC appear on the show before. And as we say to them before they come on, you have the deepest bench in the whole industry. You really are the leading organization. As Robert Redford said, 40 years later, many people, myself included, regard the NRDC as possibly the most effective environmental organization on the planet. So what is your secret sauce? Many companies and many organizations start small. small, but they can never scale. So now, as you've scaled, how would you account, the longevity and the true collaborative spirit that your members and colleagues have?
Well, I guess I would start off by saying that my experience at the U.S. Attorney's Office taught me that young people can do a lot. That's a place where young people come in, get training, and then go on to a legal career or become a judge. And it was a great experience. I thought it was wonderful. It was a collaborative way of dealing with issues. Everybody helped everybody else. And so when I started NRDC, my goal was to have a place where we all worked together to figure out what the most important issues were and how we were going to do it, and that it was going to be on the model of a family. I don't mean that exactly like it was a family,
right.
But I wanted people who liked each other, trusted each other, worked together with each other. And then Patricia and I worked to create an ambiance outside of NRDC where people could come to our home. We had all of our picnics up there. We treated people well. We looked for ways to make people feel good. We made it clear we wouldn't put up with a lot of people lording over others depending on what position they held at NRDC. And I really believe the model of hiring really, really talented people, putting them in a good atmosphere in a good place, and letting them do their work unless they needed help. But really, when you were the kinds of people we have hired, you know who they are: David Hawkins, Ralph Cavanagh, David Goldstein, and just go through the people who have come and worked at NRDC. Sarah Chases, who's been with us for 38 years working on oceans. Francis Beinecke, who's been with NRDC for 35 years, working on a range of issues, including the oceans issues, and then really working on the management of NRDC. These are people who feel that everybody in the institution is their friend. They have an obligation to them, and we have an obligation to each other, and I think that's why people stay.
I will just add to that, being with John all these years. John's philosophy is hire the best people who are committed to the environment and then give them free rein, but always back them up and be supportive. And I think that created a very good atmosphere within the whole office and that sense of family, as John talked about earlier.
And Patricia, I love what you shared with our listeners earlier. Start small and think big, and that's actually what you've done. Unfortunately, we're down to the last minute and a half here, and I'd like you both to share any last thoughts you have with our listeners before we leave and sign off and tell our listeners again to buy your amazing and wonderful book, Force for Nature. Any last thoughts on the future of the NRDC, the future of John and Patricia Adams, and where this whole movement is going from here on in?
I'll just quickly say, and then let John finish up, that I think that the generation coming now is aware of what's happening with our environment today. We're going to the ends of the earth in extremes now to get fossil fuels, but I have great belief that solutions will be found.
Yeah, I think that I would say there's one point that we haven't made, and that's the power of the membership. We have 1,200,000, close to 300,000 members in e-activists. Members of E2, the folks that help us from Hollywood to New York to Boston. These are great people who are committed to help us achieve our goals. We've expanded out, and I look at the 75 people at NRDC who are working on energy and energy efficiency, and I know that we're going to get where we have to go. It's going to take a little bit longer, but we'll get there.
That is so great. And I want to just thank you both for your time today. Force for Nature, John and Patricia have just written. And if you can only buy one book and you're only going to read one book, upload it on your Kindle, your iPad, buy it on Amazon.com or go down to Borders, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore. Force for Nature. Patricia and John, for Mike and I, this is exactly why we started this show. I mean, to have both of you on today is truly the reason we do what we do here at Green is Good. And you are just both inspirational visionaries that have shared your message of hope today. And we just want to thank you and just say that you are both living proof that green is good.
Thank you very much.